We're delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Religious Festival protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India. It's a pleasure to present today Indianization of Southeast Asia, Himanshu Prabha Ray and Andrea Acri in conversation with William Dalrymple. Between the 4th and the 8th centuries, large swaths of Southeast Asia took on the Hindu and Buddhist religions, Sanskrit as a court and sacred language, and Indic-influenced forms of art and architecture and ways of living. Two leading experts discuss how and why this happened and ask if the influence was entirely one way. Himanshu Prabha Ray is an author and historian. A recent book includes Coastal Shrines and Transnational Maritime Networks across India and Southeast Asia, Hinduism in Practice, the Temple in History, and she co-edited Power, Presence and Space, South Asian Rituals in Archaeological Context. She's a fellow at Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. Andrea Acri holds the chair of Tantric Studies at the École Pratique du Hautes Études in Paris. He was a faculty member of the research and higher education institutions in India, Singapore, Australia, and the Netherlands. His main research interests are Seva and Buddhist Tantric traditions and the comparative religious history of South and Southeast Asia, with special emphasis on connected histories and intra-Asian maritime transfers. William Dalrymple is one of Britain's great historians and the best-selling author of the Wilson Prize-winning White Mughals, The Last Mughal, which won the Duff Cooper Prize and the Hemingway and the Kapuscinski Prize-winning Return of a King. His most recent book, The Anarchy, was longlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize 2019, among others. A frequent broadcaster, he has written and presented 3 television series, one of which won the Grayson Award for Best Documentary Series at BAFTA. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, the Royal Asiatic Society, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and writes regularly for the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, and the Guardian. In 2018, he was presented with the prestigious President's Medal by the British Academy for his outstanding literary achievement and for co-founding the Jaipur Literature Festival. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comment sections. Ladies and gentlemen, Indianization of Southeast Asia, Himanshu Prabha Ray and Andrea Acri in conversation with William Dalrymple.
In 1964, the pioneering French historian Georges Sedèche wrote the following: "The story of the expansion of Indian civilization to the east has not yet been told in its entirety. It is one of the outstanding events in the history of the world, one that has determined the destiny of a good portion of mankind." That he wrote in his book, The Indianized States of Southeast Asia, in 1964. Since then, there has been an avalanche of new scholarship, much of it opposing the approach taken by Sedèche and emphasizing not the influence of India, but the influence of Southeast Asia. Other historians have emphasized the dialogue, and there's been a very fruitful and sometimes heated debate about the nature of what is called the Indianization of Southeast Asia. And we have today 2 of the leading historians at the center of that debate. Himanshu Prabha Ray is well known to all of us at Jaipur, one of India's most distinguished historians, who has written entire libraries on the subject and is the matriarch of Indian maritime studies and the go-to authority that many of us seek out the opinion of whenever we want to learn about this subject. We have with us also a new pretender to this crown, Andrea Acri, who is an Italian academic working in Paris, but who has specialized in the subject of Esoteric Buddhism and has produced a number of extraordinary works on the subject, another one of which is coming out in a few months, which he's kindly sent me PDFs of, and is going to, again, radically transform the subject. I'm going to shut up now and let first Andrea tell the early part of the story of this Indianization process and lay out some of the controversies which have animated it. And then Himanshu will take over talking about the later period, particularly on Hinduism. So more early and Buddhism to begin with, then slightly later and Hinduism to follow, but it's a complicated and intermixed subject. So I suspect the two will cross over and interweave with each other. time is limited, so I'm going to shut up and go straight on to Andrea and let him fire away. And I'm very, very envious of his gorgeous background, which is, I think, is Bali, the rice fields of Bali.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. All right, so I start sharing my screen. So thank you so much, William, for the introduction and for setting the stage. Indeed, today I would like to start to approach the problem from maybe a somewhat different angle, to have a short historiographical introduction and to go back in time to the early period, indeed, perhaps even before Indianization. Now, when you speak about Indianization, as you did, we use quotation marks, right? I think it is really important to stress this. Maybe it's not going to make me very popular, but I like to stress the fact that even the word India, like South Asia, Southeast Asia, is just a construct, actually. So this is just, these terms have been constructed. They have been shaped and contained into fields of studies in the post-colonial period, mainly. So I like to quote Daud Ali, and I think this quotation beautifully captures the problem. He speaks about onward historical development culminated in the formation of modern nationalism, etc., when we describe phenomena belonging to the pre-modern world, where no such concepts as nation states or even regions or macro regions existed. So we have to be careful with the words. So we have to be aware of the history of these terms. It's very important before even we start talking about these problems. And I think there is a need really to reconceptualize the region. When we talk about India and Southeast Asia and Indianization of Southeast Asia, we have to use a different imagination. We have to imagine a different narrative, I think. Now, we look at the region, right, including indeed Southeast Asia, parts of China, and there's been a recent trend in scholarship to develop such new concepts, for instance, a Sanskrit cosmopolis or Buddhist ecumeny, Maritime Asia, Shaiva Age, so to capture the cultural transfer in a different manner than just individuate the separate blocks of South and Southeast Asia, India, and the other. And I'm going to list a few of them. Well, the history of scholarship, it all started with the idea of India extra Gangam, so the India on the other side of the river Ganga by early French scholars. Then the idea of monsoon Asia by Paul Moose and also in part those early French intellectuals. The paradigm of Greater India, seeing India as the great civilizing force of Asia, elaborated by Indian nationalists, Hindu reformers, etc. And the paradigm that was very influential up to nowadays, formulated by Oliver Wolters, that is the Indianization versus localization. So the kind of shared common outlook of Southeast Asia as a region. So that was the period of the elaboration of the area studies paradigm, and Wolters was a big player in it. Then we have another interesting idea, the convergence idea by Hermann Kulke, a historian of India, who sees parallel processes of civilization across the Bay of Bengal. So the civilization of India and Southeast Asia would have been very similar, especially when it comes to certain social and political developments. Then another impetus has been given by Sheldon Pollock, the Sanskritist Sheldon Pollock, with the concept of Sanskrit cosmopolis and vernacular millennium. Now, this was very focused on literature, Sanskrit language, but there is a very important concept that Pollock captured, that is, in the first millennium, it doesn't really make sense to distinguish Southeast Asia from Northern Indian from South India, in the sense that the Sanskritization of South India was pretty much similar as the Sanskritization of Southeast Asia. This actually reminds me of the construction of the very categories of South and Southeast Asia by Ian Mabbott. So basically, just to give you a brief idea of the debate that has been unfolding over the past decades, etc. I think now there is a need to go beyond this area studies paradigm to again tap on the advancement of borderless history, for example, or connected history, Sanjay Subramanian, I can mention, or other concepts to capture this transfer. For instance, Sunil Gupta's idea of an interaction zone in the Bay of Bengal, Also very important is the maritime focus. Himanshu Ray has written a lot about it, as well as other historians, and especially the Indian Ocean as a force that allowed the transfer of people idea across this vast geographical region. Also the critique of meta-geography by Lewis and Wigan. So the critique of this macro area that we are so obsessed with. And the very idea of Eurasia and the networks that crossed Eurasia as really the important, very important drive for certain civilizational processes, historical processes, all the way from Europe to East Asia. And the idea of Sino-Pacific by Andrew Abalahin, including Southern China, Japan, and the Austronesian world as one cultural configuration. Now, I think it's very important to talk about this in the long duration. So not just stop at the early centuries of our era to the Hindu and Buddhist part, but go beyond that, back in time to understand this region as already a shared history. And recently, Pierre-Yves Mangan indeed already acknowledged that the relationship between Southeast Asian and South Asian society had already come a long way before the first evidence, extant evidence, archaeological evidence of contacts, linguistic, archaeological, etc. It's very important to acknowledge. So the question he formulated is, was Southeast Asia Indianized before Indianization, right? Were there comparable processes at play? Now, there is a shift of chronological parameters, but no substantial change in the theoretical framework. And I think we need to look beyond this. So we need to describe these comparable processes along the way, along the line Kulke did, or perhaps even enlarge the area and look at this early monsoon Asian paradigm elaborated by French scholars. Now, I should come back to this, reaction to the greater Indian paradigm, putting perhaps too much emphasis on India and the localization idea elaborated by Walters and other. Now, there is been a lot of insistence in past years to give, let's say, it's a very good idea to give more agency to Southeast Asians. This is all good. But there's also been a tendency to distinguish too much about this cosmopolitan Indian high cultural elements and other local place-specific elements that would have played such an important role in Southeast Asia. So that often Southeast Asian cultures is seen as a synthesis or hybridization between foreign influences and indigenous elements. This is often, it's not often not clear what is really local and indigenous, right? It's not, the parameters are not very clearly discussed. It's ambiguous more often than not. And I think it's logically fallacious. So this local versus cosmopolitan, right? The local was already cosmopolitan, I believe, because the local was the process of, relation of contacts and transfers since time immemorial across this immense area, especially along the maritime routes, right? And also, if we focus too much on literacy and written text, I think we cannot do justice to these dynamics. Now, we really need to do a borderless history and geography, I think, here to capture these fluid dynamics of transfer, and especially to transcend these boundaries between nation states and also between cosmopolitan and so perceivedly local phenomena. Okay, so we really need to ask what were the flows and interactions across and beyond this region. Now, South and Southeast Asia belong to the same eco-cultural zone, if I may say, monsoon Asia. And there are a lot of commonalities in this area. Speaking about material culture, crops, cults, ancestral worship, for example, the importance of Naga, snakes, serpent cults in both Buddhism, Hinduism, and local religions, all the way to China, and sacralization of natural features, and the polycentric sacred geography. Now, if we look at another very inspiring quotation by Paul Moose describing monsoon Asia, I think we really captured the importance of the sea to connect, right? So if we see India and Southeast Asia as divided by the sea, we should rather see them as connected by the sea. And it makes more sense to imagine connection over 1,000 kilometers of sea rather than connection between, for example, southern and northern India. It was actually easier to travel from India to Southeast Asia, perhaps, than from Kashmir to Tamil Nadu. So there's no wonder about the richness of the cultural interactions between the two zones. And even Siddhas, who has been often accused of being like, yeah, too Brahmano-centric, India-centric. Well, he actually writes himself that there was already a common civilizational configuration between South and Southeast Asia. So if we look at this area, we use it as a heuristic tool to imagine the relationship, the interactions. I think we're going to learn many interesting things. For instance, this area has the largest amount of linguistic families in the world. It hosts most of the population of the world, more than a half, I believe. There's a lot of linguistic mixing, migrations, Austroasiatic, Austronesian, Tibeto-Burman, and Indo-European, Sanskrit, for instance. It was actually an early center of human population. And so there's an incredible, interesting mix of cultural packages, genes, languages, religions, etc. So it's a huge contact zone. I think we can use this as we use the term Eurasia, which is now accepted in historical mainstream history. My colleague Ian Sinclair from Australia actually has elaborated this, has drawn this nice map superimposing the Indo-Malaya ecozone within Monsoon Asia and the extent of Sanskritic or pseudo-Sanskritic epigraphy. You can see they almost coincide. Why? Well, this is one of the interesting questions we should try to answer. And speaking about the interactions that are not only monodirectional, not only from India to Southeast Asia, we can look, for example, the early migration of Southeast Asian people, in this case, the Austroasiatic speakers from Southeast Asia into India. And these Austroasiatic speakers probably were one of the many substratum languages in the northern Indian subcontinent in the early era. So probably this idea of Johannes Broncos of Greater Magadha, this non-Brahmanical civilization in northeastern India, well, probably they were speakers of Austroasiatic languages. And this bears implication on entire Indian history, and of course on the relationship and the interactions between India and Southeast Asia. I might have to skip a bit here, but you got the idea. I don't have enough time.
Fantastic introduction. You have about 3 more minutes, I think,
yeah.
Andrea.
Okay, sure. I will just move to the Buddhist part now. So as a person interested in esoteric Buddhism, in the spread of esoteric Buddhism along the maritime lanes, I've been trying to conceptualize this more as a multi-directional transmission, and also very important, the networks, the human networks of masters, and the importance of Southeast Asia as a terminus itself, rather than a mere passage for people, for monks traveling from India and China, and vice versa. All right, so if we can visualize the map, for example, so the importance of traveling masters who were extremely well traveled and who crossed the seas, the ocean, Indian Ocean, to initiate disciples, to get texts, and some of them even traveled twice back and forth from India and China via Southeast Asia. This is another map that gives the idea of the location of the important Buddhist centers along the maritime, trade routes, the coasts, and the interlands connected to these routes. Now, a few words about Southeast Asia in just over 1 minute. The innovative, aspect. So Southeast Asia, I believe, was really harbored a very interesting, ideas, innovations. It was not a periphery who just absorbed Indian ideas and kind of regurgitated them. Well, we can just have a look, for instance, at the scale and originality of the archaeological remains of the temples like Angkor Wat and Borobudur. They are the largest and perhaps most exquisitely carved monuments, existing in the Indic world. Yes, I will just move to another interesting point. That is the Ramayana, for instance, in Java, the continuous representation in Chandi Shiva in Prambanan, another incredible, feat. And the earliest representation of the Karana poses of Indian dances probably found in Central Java, not even in India. So Java was actually before, it already elaborated the depiction iconographically before India. another example of this. The earliest epigraphical references to zero are in Southeast Asia and almost 200 years before the first occurrences in India. The problem of prototypes, you often compare Indian temples and Southeast Asian temples. It turns out that Southeast Asian temples in many cases were contemporary to their supposed Indian counterparts. And finally, I should skip this. Actually, we know evidence of masters traveling to Southeast Asia to learn, and they brought back, like Atisha, probably new doctrines, new knowledge from Sumatra, Suvarnadvipa to India and Tibet. One final example of so-called pizza effect is this, eight-armed Amoga Pasha, which was probably invented in Sumatra, so elaborated on Indian models, and only was transmitted back to India and then retransmitted back to Indonesia in the 11th, 12th century.
Andrea, just quickly for 1 second before we hand over to Himanshu,
yes.
Explain your wonderful concept of the pizza effect, which
well, yes,
I love.
Well, the pizza was invented in Naples, in Italy, so they say, and then, but then it was really made popular in the US. It was exported by Italian immigrants, and then it was kind of repackaged there, new flavors were added, and then it really became a global phenomenon because of the popularity probably it enjoyed in the US, and then Italy re-imported it in this newly repackaged form in Italy itself.
Lovely.
This is what I mean.
So you're saying that this is what happened with Buddhism and Esoteric Buddhism, that it travels out to Java and Indonesia and comes back to India and Tibet in a kind of revved up way. Lovely.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so
fantastic. Much. Thank you. Mille grazie. Thank you so much. Himanshu, over to you.
So let me start with with the topic of the discussion today, and I'm really pleased that Andrea has already laid down the theoretical frameworks, and he has talked about the pizza effect, which is very interesting and also very relevant to what I would like to say. And I would like to say that the term Indianization itself is a pizza effect. It started as a European terminology and really was an effort at couching what the Europeans and particularly the French considered the civilizing mission in Asia. And this, of course, it was the French Indologists, Sylvain Lévy and so on, and Georges Sédès, who wrote in 1948. So really in the early 20th century, the Europeans discovered Southeast Asia. They discovered the civilization of India as well. And it was here that the term, unfortunately, which was termed Indianization, and the nationalists got blamed for it, was invented. So thanks for that pizza effect. And now it has traveled the world. And we are into area studies, and Southeast Asianists defending, Southeast Asian civilization against this onslaught of Indianization. So great. And of course, in India, we do have 1926, the Greater India Society, of which Tagore was the patron. But let me also say that all these terminologies, whether it's Indianization, localization, which we heard, convergence of Kulke, the Sanskrit cosmopolis of Sheldon Pollock, the Buddhist cosmopolis and the esoteric Buddhism of Andrea Acri, all these, in my opinion, they have a single-centered focus on the state and political history. And whether we use the term Brahmanization, Sanskritization in the Indian context, the focus here has been on political history and on the state. And in my presentation, I would like to move away from here, and I would like to talk about shared heritage across the Bay of Bengal. And as has been mentioned, my own interest has been in maritime history, not just in maritime history of Buddhism and Hinduism, but I like to go back and look at very mobile, small-scale communities, the fishing and sailing communities, the communities who found the pearls and the shells, and the communities who were involved in salt baking. We also know from archaeological evidence that there was a transfer of crops, tubers such as ginger, sandalwood, these sandalwood and ginger both, and this is Tom Hugerforth's work, where he talks about the transfer of crops. And he talks about sandalwood, which was indigenous to Indonesia, but has been found in prehistoric contexts in Neolithic South India. So already by these sort of early movements of small-scale mobile communities, fishing and sailing communities, crops, trading groups who are trading not just in luxury items, but in agricultural production, metals, plants, so on. And also the movements of religious clergy, the Buddhist monks and nuns and Brahmins, scribes, artisans, so on, trading guilds. So the point I'm trying to make is that I would like to look at this as a shared heritage across the Bay of Bengal, which was shared not by the elite groups, but by across the board. And I have spelled out some of these across the board. Now, in the 20 minutes that I have, or 15 minutes, sorry, whatever minutes I have, I'd like to talk about Buddhisms. And please note, I'm talking not about Buddhism, not about a brand of Buddhism or a linear development of Buddhism. I'm talking about Buddhisms. So different kinds of Buddhism. And is there something that held them together? Is there something that was common to them? Peter Skilling has argued that relic enshrinement and worship of the relics was common across South and Southeast Asia. And who carried these relics? On your screen, you can see the 3rd, 4th century CE gold relic casket from Nagarjuna Kunda on the Andhra coast east of India, which I will talk in a little moment. But who carried these relics? These relics were carried by monks and nuns as they traveled. And I talked in my earlier slide about the different groups, and monks and nuns being one of them. The second point that is important, I don't think I'll have time today to develop it, is that the nature of relics changed over time and included written specimens, texts, bronze images, and so on. Many of these bronze images are in museums in Europe and across Southeast Asia, and are studied for their art and aesthetic appeal. But essentially, these were ritual items. But let me move on, and let me just talk about the maritime orientation of some of the Buddhist sites on the Andhra coast, starting from Kalingapatnam up here, right down all along the Andhra coast. We're looking at something like 2nd century BCE to 4th, 5th century CE. But this arrow points to the site of Nagarjuna Kunda, which continued well into the 13th, 14th century as a Buddhist site. And you have Amravati across from there. It's here. So these are some of the early Buddhist sites, which clearly are on the coast and have a maritime orientation. The site of Nagarjuna Kunda is particularly important because it was one of the sites which was excavated over several seasons. It was also because the Nagarjuna Sagar Dam was built, salvage archaeology was done. This is a site which dates from the 1st millennium BCE to the 16th century CE. And it has a range of Iron Age megalithic sites, but also Buddhist establishments, Hindu sites, Hindu temples, and Jain shrines. Now notice this 3rd and 4th century inscription. This inscription, which is from Nagarjuna Kunda, refers to monks, Theriyas, who took Buddhism to Kashmir, Gandhar, to the country of the Yavanas being the foreigners, Chin being China, Vanavas being Banavasi on the west coast, Vanga, the island of Tamraparni or Sri Lanka. So we have early literary references to monks and nuns traveling. And along with this, at Nagarjuna Kunda itself, there are several chaityas, several stupas, which yielded relics. Some of them have a royal connection, only 4 out of the 9 relic stupas, whereas the others have yielded a whole range of relics, including a colossal Buddha image, which is now headless, but a gold tube was found with pearls inside it. And of course, the modern history of Buddhism, as we all know, is the fact that one of the relics from Nagarjuna Kunda is now enshrined in the Mula Gandhakuti at Sarnath, which is the current site. A view of some of the relics. There are 20 relic caskets which were found at 9 different locations, and this is just to give you a sense. I had shown you the gold relic casket. You see the silver and the terracotta relic caskets here. I'd also mentioned that the nature of relics changed. It was not just bone ash, as was earlier, but texts, particularly the Pratitya Samutpad Sutra, or dependent origination as relic. The dependent origination was also used as a relic. And we find this at least from the 2nd century CE, both engraved on relic caskets and deposited inside stoops in India. But also the fact that many clay tablets with this inscription were found all across the northern region. But let me shift across the ocean, and let me shift across the Bay of Bengal to Myanmar, to Burma. And it is not often realized or understood that some of the earliest Buddhist sites were in Burma, and these are the Pew cities in Myanmar. These have been inscribed, you see them on the map on the Irrawaddy River. These have also been inscribed as World Heritage Sites recently. They date from the 3rd century BCE to the 4th, 5th century CE. And they are very rich and wealthy sites. They have hydraulic, agricultural, and urban development, and these are city sites. They're also known for the complex funerary rituals that was already there and practiced at these sites. But we see from the 4th to the 8th century, an emergence of a local elite as Janice Stargard, who has excavated many of these sites and who was also very important and instrumental in putting these on the World Heritage Map. So she argues that the local elite used Pali, Sanskrit, and Pew language. So the languages were varied, and by no means, Sanskrit was not the only language, and I would like to reiterate this. Whether of political power, as Sheldon Pollock puts, or otherwise. But there are many languages which are known all across Southeast Asia. And this is no different in Myanmar, in the Irrawaddy Valley. But what is interesting is that they're written in the Southern Brahmi script. And I think this needs some more research, some more discussion as to the use of a script to inscribe several languages. This, of course, is written partly in Pew, and this is an inscribed stone urn from Myanmar.
What date is this, Himanshu?
Sorry?
What date is this?
This is 4th, 5th century. And this is the kind of urns which were quite common at the Pew sites, the burial urns. These are stone urns, and they record the emergence of kingship at Sri Kshetra. And this particular inscription has been seen as an attempt by the kings to associate themselves with the fame of the Guptas, and that's what the inscription says, and some of the adoption of Sanskrit titles in the inscription. But along with that, while we do have all those burial urns, we also have this most fascinating, the most fascinating survival of the oldest Pali texts that were written in the Southern Brahmi script. These are on gold leaves. And this is from Kinba Mound, also in Sri Kshetra. These are fascinating. These you can see some of the gold leaves with the Pali inscriptions, and these are all religious texts. As also you see the silver reliquary on your screen, which is 6th century. It also shows Buddha images, the seated Buddha images that are here. And so this treasure really, and this wealth of both relics as well as inscriptions in a variety of languages is further supported by what we get in terms of the archaeological evidence for stoops, 4th to 6th century stoops. This is Yahanda Mound, also Sri Kshetra, and it has, again, visible the shape of the stoop, the use of bricks, the size of bricks has affinities to those from Andhra. Another kind of affinity are the stamped ceramics. These have been found all across North India, much fewer in South India, but certainly, well, they have been at Arikamedu. You do have stamped pottery, but different kind of stamps. But nevertheless, you do see on ceramics, and really the extent to which these are used, the Buddha image, which is in that yellow circle highlighted, and also Srivatsa and other kinds of stamps used on the pottery and the ceramics. So my question then is, who was the agency for change? How did all of this change, and how did this sort of shared heritage that I'm talking about, how did this come about? I did talk about traveling monks and nuns, scholars, scribes by the sea route, and I would like to say nuns as well, because we often don't talk about women. And certainly I would like to stress that these also included nuns, and there is early evidence of monks and nuns traveling not just to Southeast Asia, but to Sri Lanka and all the way to China. And they certainly carried relics and set up stoops wherever they went. Now, this is the ceramic that you see on your screen. That is from Sri Lanka, from the excavated site of Tissa Maharama. Please note the dates. It's 4th, 3rd century BCE. So it's fairly early dates. For the shard is often referred to as a related ware vessel, which I will not go to, because that's usually a lot of the historians and archaeologists, and including both in Southeast Asia and South Asia, often talk about related ware as either imported or in trade. But I would like to use it to highlight this inscription, which is on this vessel, which is a dish. And it says it's the vessel of the nun Chitra. There are many others. I have chosen one to stress the fact that we are looking at nuns, and to stress the fact that we are looking at writing, which we find used across the ocean at this point in time. And this is further substantiated by what we get from shipwrecks. The Intan shipwreck, which is 10th century, which was found in Indonesia. It was found 45 nautical miles east of the Sumatran coast. And we are really looking at the 10th century. And it contained a fascinating cargo, which was not just of bronze figurines, standing Buddha, Bodhisattva images, but it also included ritual vessels, stupika molds, votive tablets, mirrors, mirror handles, and so on. And it had a rare 9th century standing bronze Buddha image, and of course a large number of seated images of the Buddha, but bronze ingots, bars, and so on. So the point I'm making is that we often see shipwreck sites as really carrying cargo of either Chinese ceramics or of trade items. But what we miss out and what we do not often connect with are the ritual objects that were also carried on ships and have been reported from shipwreck sites. So I would like to then conclude by highlighting that in my frame of reference and in my work and the way I see it, what we are looking at is interconnected and shared heritage across the seas. And certainly not looking at looking at blocks, whether it's India or Southeast Asia or whatever else, which are really constructed, as Andrea said, and certainly I agree, these are constructed blocks. But let us look at shared heritage rather than still continuing to draw lines across the map. And I would particularly like to highlight the data from Nagapattinam. It's on the Tamil coast. The district has been, you can see it on the map of India. It was the part that juts out into the ocean. This is also the district that was badly hit by the tsunami. But Nagapattinam district even today is known for the fishing communities, for the large catch of fish. But in the past, and this was an important Buddhist site. And I can go on and talk about Nagapattinam, for a long time, because Nagapattinam has often been underrepresented when in studies of Buddhism. It is a site which has yielded a range of bronzes, seated stone Buddha images, and you can see the one on your screen. The one on your screen is a 10th, 11th century granite Buddha, but it is from Sumatra. It is from Kotachina in Sumatra, which is marked on the map with the arrow. But similar images of seated Buddha images are are reported and are available. These are life-size stone images, which have been found all across, not just Nagapattinam, but also into Kanchipuram. And so the understanding that there was a first Buddhism and then came Hinduism, I think is flawed. We need to think much more in terms of plurality of religions and not in linear development, either within religions or one after the other, as Buddhism followed by Hinduism. And certainly Nagapattinam is a great example of the fact that several kinds of Buddhism survived, and I'm back to Buddhisms and not a Buddhism or a kind of specific Buddhism, but that it survived, and it survived well into the 14th and 16th century. And William, you will remember the talk that Vidya Dehejia and I had, and the fact that, did Buddhism decline in India and then it survived and so elsewhere and so on. And the fact that all these, provide dates as which show that Buddhism continued as late as 16th century. So with that, I will stop and would again like to stress that let us talk about interconnected and shared heritage across the seas. So thank you very much.
Thank you, both of you. Absolutely fantastic, and a spectacular canter through thousands of years and tens of thousands of miles of pilgrimage and travel and cultural interaction. We just have time for a couple of quick questions. First of all, Andrea, I'm very interested in what you pointed out at the end of your lecture, that the degree to which it's very difficult to take these Southeast Asian sites as in any sense a provincial echo of what's going on in India, partly because they're bigger. Do you want to just talk about the scale of some of these things? I mean, Borobudur, Angkor, presumably is roughly contemporary with the big temple at Tanjore, but what, it's 10 times bigger? How come these Southeast Asian sites are so much bigger, and what's the reason for the scale?
Interesting question. Well, maybe the ego of the kings who built that, or let's say, obviously it reflects the wealth. It is Indians were very well aware of the wealth of Southeast Asia. They mention it in the source. Arabs were also. So these were kingdoms with very wealthy because of trade, because of rice cultivation, etc. So the crops were plentiful. So I think it reflects the availability of resources, but also, of course, the devotion of the sponsors, and perhaps the willingness even to, as a periphery, to become a center. Something that happens in China also, with this Manjushri cult. So perhaps the peripheries were aware that it was kind of modular geography. So they were becoming centers in themselves. They wanted to become centers of Buddhism or Shaivism, etc., and attract people. And in your two books on esoteric Buddhism, you've emphasized the degree to which things can come back from these places to India. And you give the example of Atisha, an Indian monk who goes to Indonesia, then comes back, having learned stuff in Indonesia, and goes up and founds Tabo in Himachal. Yes, exactly. And also went to Tibet, and there is evidence of text by his master in Sumatra being transmitted and preserved in the Tibetan canon, especially tantric sadhanas, again, to stress the nature of the Buddhisms that were practiced in those regions. So it seems that Southeast Asia was a center in itself for this cult, and Atisha was going there to learn, as many others were doing. As also, Taranatha writes in his chronicles, that a lot of monks actually went to Southeast Asia and vice versa. There's plenty of Southeast Asian monks. You already know by the Devapala inscription in Nalanda, that is big monastery being sponsored by a ruler from Sumatra, and also perhaps even evidence of religious influences like the Bhadrachari Pranidhana being engraved in Nalanda, something which doesn't happen. Quotation from a Mahayana source doesn't happen normally in India, but perhaps it was again an influence from Southeast Asia, given that the Bhadrachari is represented at Borobudur. We don't know. Fantastic. Himanshu, what's your view of the pizza effect? Do you think this is a useful term, that the idea of ideas originally exported from India coming back in a sort of revved up
form with new flavors, to use Andrea's analogy.
I'm not sure I agree that there is an origin, there is a decline, and there is a change. So I do not see that linearity, and hence my discomfort, with influences, because influences is when you show something, that was originally in one place, and then you find it in some other place. And then you say, oh, well, it was there first, and, and then it is now somewhere else. And so it is this influence going there, or that influence coming here. So this sort of tracing of influences, in my opinion, I think is not a very productive way of moving forward. And a more productive way would really be to look at, as I have said, the changes and the development. Because let me also say that I often read in a lot of literature newly produced, Indian Buddhism, Southeast Asian Buddhism, and I fail to understand. I mean, even in India, what is Indian Buddhism? I mean, if you look at Nalanda, it is contemporary to Nagapattinam, but it is not the same site. And you have Kurkihar bronzes, which come from Kanchipuram. Now, are the bronzes the same as what you get in Kanchipuram? They're not. They're contemporary. So what are we talking about when we use this terminology? And I think it's best, in my opinion, to drop. Yes, Indianization was it has its historiography and so on, but let us move on and let us look at how things developed. There is no homogeneous Indian Buddhism or Southeast Asian Buddhism. So
and people are going backwards and forwards.
Exactly. And as regards Atisha, we heard about Atisha going to Tabo and so on and so forth. But the depiction of the sutras at Tabo monastery is very different from that at Borobudur. Yeah. So I think there is,
even though they're just illustrating the same text.
Exactly. Yeah. And even Borobudur, even though what is being represented at one monument, the text may have been known much wider, but they're not picked up by everybody. So why only Borobudur? So obviously there's something distinctive about Borobudur, which has nothing to do with Indonesian Buddhism or, whatever Buddhism one might term it. So I really think that we need to look at micro regions, micro histories, and then move from there forward, rather than looking at this macro level, origin, decline, diffusion, influences. I think that's, in my view, not a very productive way.
Himanshu, Andrea Acri, thank you so much. I would recommend the many, many books of both these great authors, and they will be available, I think, at the Festival Bookshop. So please read more, go online, read the extraordinary works of both these. It's a fascinating subject and one which is developing fast and new ideas are coming. So thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And thanks for having us here. Bye.
Thank you, Himanshu Prabha Ray, Andrea Acri, and William Dalrymple for that remarkable conversation. And thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. Sessions are ongoing across all three of our venues: Front Lawn, Bank of Baroda, Mughal Tent, and Darbar Hall. Hope to see you in the next session.